So hello everyone. I'm Hongbo Fu and acting head of the arts and machine creativity at HKST. And welcome to the second talk in the Creative Synergy seminar series. And Happy New Year, everyone. And it's our great pleasure to have Professor Harpreet SAREEN and as the invited speaker for this second talk in the series. So let me introduce Professor SAREEN first. And yeah, Harpreet SAREEN, maybe I just call Harpreet SAREEN, is Associate Professor of Interaction and Media Design at the Parsons School of Design, the new school, where he directs the Synthetic Ecosystems Lab. He has been held visiting professors ships internationally at several institutions, including, I think, MIT Media Lab. And he earned graduate degrees from MIT Media Lab and also the University of Tokyo. His research explores post-anthropocentric design, developing hybrid technologies that integrate living organisms with digital systems to reimagine human-nature relationships. His research has been published at top venues like CHI, SIGGRAPH, and DRS, and his art and design works have been exhibited internationally at like Ars Electronica Festival, Somerset House, MIT Museum, etc. His research has been recognized and by many prestigious awards, including CHI Golden Mouse, Edison Gold, MIT Technology Review under Certified Innovator, and the Fast Company World Changing Ideas. So today he is going to share his research about design with living matter and the machines. It's called Hybrid Turn, a very interesting title. So yeah, let's welcome Professor Harpreet.
Thank you so much for this generous introduction. Let me just make sure that everything still works. Get started. Okay, thank you so much for inviting me here today. And one of the most unique things about visiting any university is how quickly it can convey to someone where the present is and where the future is going to be. I'm glad to see the makeup of the student population here. I had some time to just walk around the campus before I met Professor Fu. And the future ideas, the dynamic nature of the campus, just about to start before the break ends. And I was happy to see this away from the tourist centers of the city. Thank you to Professor Fu for inviting me here. It's a privilege to learn about the arts and machine creativity division as well. This is a talk that is packed with a lot of projects. So I will, try to cover as much as possible. And if you have any questions towards the end, please feel free to ask me. I will also leave my email towards the end so we can have a detailed discussion even after. So before I start, for people online and for people here, I would like you to do a short exercise with me. And I would like you to close your eyes and think of a scene in nature. I will count to 10 seconds. Okay, that's 10 seconds. How many of you imagined a human in this scene? Can you raise your hand? Anyone online? None of you. If your answer was no, my question throughout this talk really is to consider why not. As humans, we have a lot of separation, a lot of hierarchies of what nature is, our position within nature. And in a lot of design work, in a lot of artwork, I'm trying to bridge this nature culture bias and to think about new connections between humans and non-humans. I was born in India. These are the sort of landscapes that I grew up seeing, wheat fields in the state of Punjab. How the technology shaped this state from becoming food scarce to food surplus, how it has shaped people's relation to fields and farms and to their lands, also defines how I now look at technology and my relation to technology as well. This is what inspired the talk today, the hybrid turn, because when I started to learn about technology, I had a very conventional look at technology, and now I'm sort of branching out to look at technology much more expansively. It also is sort of a reminder, if the telescope forced us, the humans, to see the Earth as not the center of cosmos, and this was the first great decentering. Darwin, when he proposed his theory of evolution, that was the second great decentering. I feel we are now at the precipice of another great decentering, where we recognize that intelligence was never ours alone. We are discovering, or rather rediscovering, the fact that cognition has always been distributed across roots, fungal networks, ecosystems, long before it was recognized in the silicon chips alone. So for me, as an engineer, as an interaction designer, I believe we are going through a paradigm shift in interaction design, where we expand the horizons of interaction design to include nature, non-humans, and most of my time at Parsons is to think about that, about hybrid systems, not only metaphorically, but also literally, where biological and computational processes are fundamentally intertwined. I run the Synthetic Ecosystems Lab, where we create plant digital hybrids, organic material interfaces. And before I show you some of my own work, here's some of my students' work. And I've worked with a lot of inspiring students over these years, whose names wouldn't fit on the screens. But just to kind of give you a glimpse of this work in the classes, I teach classes around design in safaris, poetics of matter, post-natural design, and several more that deal with the topics of nature at large. People who make things for Komodo dragons, Canadian geese, orangutans, and so on. This is one of those projects in the San Diego Zoo where a student is creating a project for an orangutan. This is an orangutan in her conservation environment, where she's trying to solve a puzzle using a tool that she finds in her bedroom, and then is going to attempt to solve a puzzle. And this is a study on the cognitive enrichment of animals without using food. This is a traffic light system for Canadian geese, rehabilitation system for lemurs in the wild. When lemurs are injured, they are brought to a conservation environment. They need to rehabilitate. So this is a system for the Duke Lemur Center. Bee vaccination systems, bioleathers that I will touch upon later towards the end of the talk. And very recently, some machines that can draw and paint or change the structure of titanium using a custom pen, which is able to anodize titanium, and we are able to use it for a drawing machine that is then able to draw different patterns. This is not the traditional painting technique where you use a brush. This is an electrified brush that is sort of changing the structure of titanium and can create different colors by changing the voltage. So programmatically, we're able to do this by using a software and then baking the image onto titanium. A lot of studio teaching, where people create all sorts of self-directed projects, behaviors in sort of objects around us. A lot of my students are from different backgrounds, from linguistics to fashion design to even lawyers sometimes. I've even taught a priest one time. So there's a lot of diversity in the students at Parsons. So that was about my students, but my own background spans industry research at Google and Microsoft, and academic institutions across Austria, France, Japan. All of these institutions, all of this work, all of the work that I've done over the past is asking similar questions, I believe, but from different angles. My research started from the field called human-computer interaction, and in the quest of trying to make technologies more and more human, I was working in formats to extract the digital out of the screens, to wrap it onto the world. Displays that are flying, displays that are holographic, ambient media and physical spaces, terrariums that you can talk to and ask what's the weather in Seattle. And somewhere along the line, I think I just started to question the meaning of interaction, or what it means to really actually even be a human. And at that time, I took a fundamentally different stance, and this is when I started to do work that I do right now. Fundamentally, what do interaction designers do? The first time I came across the term interaction design, I asked a designer, I asked the people who were teaching this, and they said interaction design is designing interactions. And I thought it was the most cyclical nonsense that I'd heard, and after being lost for a number of years, and after doing this work for a number of years, I now feel interaction designers do not design interactions, they design relationships. And conventionally, we design relationships with the computers, the machines around us, but also, relationships now with the world around us. So when an interaction designer designs, they consider all of the senses, the physiology, visuals, other stimuli that a human has. But I think the word behavior captures this pretty well, and it is very fundamental to doing interaction design. However, if we go back to the sociological definitions of behavior, it includes an animal or a person. And why did we stop considering this? Why did we stop considering other forms of life when designing interactions? That's where I situate my research. My research is really about designing with and for non-humans, bionic organisms. This tension between living and non-living is at the forefront of my studies: organic, inorganic, living, non-living, and I specifically focus on this intersection. This world of living and non-living may seem whimsical, it may seem at odds with each other, and yet I feel it's only because of our broken relationship with nature. For thousands of years, our biological materials, they were in direct connection to our practices of fabrication, food, medicine, and so on. These materials, they were culturally specific. They were often grown outside a house, about which a household had specific knowledge and a relationship that I feel was disrupted due to the Industrial Revolution, where we were able to look at synthetic materials and not know where the materials come from, the sourcing of those materials, and so on. Even in some philosophical texts, I mean, the way people look at nature changes based on the eras. And in some philosophical texts in the West, people even talk about nature as an unproductive wilderness made productive with the love of human labor. So right now, I consider, a lot of different ways of thinking about nature, not only through technical means, but also some cultural ways of talking about nature that I will show you later. How do we integrate with nature? And in this bigger research questions, my sub-questions are, what is the choice and control look like for technology in non-humans? How do we understand what is happening inside the plants, or the mechanisms of plant physiology interacting with the surrounding environment? What are the organic alternatives to our technologies? This is an on-plant robot that grows plants into different architectural shapes. How do we rethink the technology in the context of this merger? How do we design a conservation environments better? This is at the San Diego Zoo with an elephant named Mary, a project around choice and control where Mary listens to the music that she wants. An auditory interface that gives choice and control to the animal. As you might have already noticed, a lot of my work over the past many years has dealt with plants. And Darwin once called the rapid movement in some of the plants as the animalness in plants. But quite often when I showcase some of this work, I get the question, why are you so fascinated by the plants? And to me, plants are the most fascinating science fiction creatures. I mean, they are self-powered, they are self-fabricating, they are self-regenerating. They carry highly advanced systems to sense and respond to the environment. We strive for such capabilities in our electronics, in our architecture, to be sustainable at scale in general. And we don't know yet how to do some of those things. So for me, I think, I'm looking for creating the right sort of intersections between technology and nature. And it all starts by recognizing the livingness in the plants. When we look at plants, the physiological signaling is so similar to what happens in our own bodies. There's a striking similarity between how plants sense and exchange information with our electrical between how they do it and how our electrical circuits do it. And plants are already signal networks in nature. The first time I was trying to explain this to someone, and they made a comment, about the direction of my work. They said, "I have no idea what you're saying." And in response to that, I created this artwork that caught on, with the people early on. This is a typical house plant. It's connected to two electrodes on either side of the plant. The electrodes are also connected to the robot at the bottom. When a light is turned on or turned off, it triggers natural electrochemical signals in a plant. So, in a controlled environment, we basically turn on or turn off the lights, and the robot is triggered by the plant, not the robot driving the plant, but the plant driving the robot. So this is how it looks like. So a plant triggering a robot based on the natural electrochemical signals to go left and right. This was a number of years ago, and it still sort of resonates with people quite a lot. But for me, from then to now, as I reflect on our current relationship with the technologies, from the time that we did not have AI to the now when we do have AI, one of the missing gaps that I notice is how heavily AI relies on text, linguistics, and mostly not at all, usually on understanding such electrochemical signals. How then we should create AI that is not only human focused, text focused, linguistics focused, but is also able to incorporate non-human conversations. And crucially, how can biological sensing inform machine learning even more? This is a pretty big gap, and it seems like a good opportunity for the many students who might be listening to this, here online or offline. Could we train AI models to, learn from plant physiological responses rather than digital sensors alone? This is one of the questions that spurred the starting of a company called the Electric Plant Company. This is a startup that I now advise in Detroit. And those people reached out to me just by looking at this artwork. They said, we have an idea. Would you like to do something with us? And they started a company that basically records plant electrophysiology signals over a long period of time to build predictability out of them. And that's the company that now runs, as a successful startup. But this idea of designing for non-humans has also gained traction recently, and I observe this sometimes in certain contexts, it's more visible than others. But there's always a tension of designing for someone else, not only for humans, but also just, especially for non-humans. This is a photo from an event called Multi-Species Constitution in LA, a gathering of researchers to debate on the rights of nature. And when I was in this gathering, I heard about this gathering before it happened, and I started to wonder, there's all these people who are going to fly from all over the world. They're going to debate about the rights of nature. Something seems missing, They're talking about plants and animals, but where are the plants and animals in this conversation, really? So can I make this tension even more visible? What if plants were occupying the space that is normally occupied by humans? And so we started to create these absurd scenarios where plants are sitting on chairs, they are occupying offices, they are sitting in a conference room, and you sort of feel like a little bit mysterious. Why is this happening? Sometimes annoyed. We also, fix the plant pots with transducers that are producing sounds like a Morse code, and left many such plants in this exhibition, some occupying offices, some sitting with the attendees, like you see here, and people were sort of sometimes confused about why there is a plant sitting here, because it is emitting these strange sounds. And apparently, when you hold your phone next to the plant, it starts to translate the Morse code, and it starts to show you what the plants are talking about. And what the plants are talking about are planetary politics. They are actually talking about humans, and they are discussing who is a human, what do they do, whether a human is a good caretaker or not. So it's not supposed to be solution oriented. Rather, this is problematizing, what is already a tension point, and it's highlighting some of those things, especially in certain contexts like this, where we discuss nature, but the voices of plants and animals are usually lacking. One of the examples here is, what are the benefits of having a human as my keeper? It says there are no benefits to having a human. A human is an annoying species of bipedal ape that pollutes the environment, takes up my space, and forgets to water me. So this is the sort of conversation that they're having amongst themselves. But this is, again, from an artistic context. Again, going back to interaction design, you've looked at this example of sensing within plants. And as an interaction designer, there's always a loop of sensing and response. And when I first started studying these plant responses, I also was curious, can we send the signals to the plants? So we induce these potential differences in the plants by taking a Venus flytrap, attaching electrodes to the mid leaf and the backbone. On the left-hand side, there's a software. On the right-hand side, there's a living plant. When you click on a leaf, it sends a signal to the leaf, to the living plant, and it closes that leaf. It bioactuates a living plant. So, we were studying, is this something that we would like to incorporate in terms of interactions? Again, back and forth, bioactuation scenarios. This also happens in a Mimosa pudica plant. As you see here, when you click on this sort of secondary branch, it sort of triggers the movement in a living plant. As you see, there's a few wires that are dangling here, and we were curious, in trying to think about substrates that allow us to have conversation with plants. Can we change the substrates to non-commercial, something that is, resonating with us in terms of the organic vision of this world? So we made this polymer called a ProDot. I made it with the help of chemists at MIT, and we put the plant in it for 24 to 48 hours. And this is what we do after that time. We slice the bark, and what we observe is a single nanowire inside the xylem of a plant, polymerized inside the plant tissue, taking the substrate that was once outside to now that is inside as a single channel. The longest wires that we've been able to grow are 10-centimeter direct connections. But I also believe, this is not only, to create interaction design scenarios, but also to think about what is the future of organic materials going to look like. Are organic materials, can we grow electronics? Can those electronics be biodegradable, not harm the plant, nor harm the species around them? If yes, what does that future look like? But again, as an HCI, scenario, which people do like to see from interaction designers, this is what we had created. We created plants we connected this to external instrumentation, and we can turn the plant into an antenna, touch sensor, motion sensor, and sense the things that are happening around the plant as well. So I guess I won't go too much into the functional detail. If there's a question later, I will maybe show one more project, but I want to switch gears and talk about this project. This is an example of a self-growing, self-repairing architecture in India that has lasted for more than 500 years. Concrete structures cannot do this because this architecture repairs itself. And the locals in that part of India, they take the aerial roots of fig trees or banyan trees, which are also actually in Hong Kong. They intertwine them together, and eventually, over a period of few years, they grow into bridges that are used by the locals to cross rivers and waterways, and they create architectural frameworks out of them. So I was curious, and I saw an intersection here with with the way locals were doing it, but could we do it with technology as well? So we created this robot that lives on a sunflower plant. Sunflower grows up by 4 inches per week. The robot moves up by 4 inches per week as well. It provides directional cues. It provides tension support like gradients, and the plant responds with its own growth logic. But also the robot is sort of able to nudge the direction of this growth. Over a period of 45 days, we were able to create, some of these shape primitives from bending, morphing, some form of spiraling, and we demonstrated some control over, such shaped primitives and published this in the field of architecture recently as well. So this is what the final shapes kind of look like, but the idea here is if you can do this with the sunflower plant, you can definitely do this with bamboo. And imagine leaving this in a bamboo forest for a long period of time, and you grow frameworks that are, furniture and not just food. So could we think about greenhouses to grow furniture rather than thinking about plants or trees as only food, along with the use of technology? That was one of the motivations of this work. To design such work, we often visit the spectrum of evolution. To understand the process, it's not only looking into the future, but also looking into the past that helps us design some of this work. And based on this thought, I want to do another short exercise with you. I will play a sound here, and I want you to try to guess what this sound is. Okay, what do you think is the sound?
It's a keto stick.
Steak.
Keto stick on an oil pan.
It's a steak on an oil pan. I would have guessed that. Someone says online, raining on shrub. Any guesses? Breathing sound. Breathing sound. Raining on a shrub and a steak on an oil pan. Actually, this is none of those things. This is the sound of underwater macroalgae in the oceans. In 2020, I was in Berkeley, California, and this was the height of the pandemic. This was 2021, actually. And I took my hydrophone and I dipped it in Lake Anza in Berkeley, and I heard some static sound. I thought my microphone was not working. And I contacted marine biologists. I asked them, are there shrimp in this area? Because shrimp also makes sound. And they said there's no shrimp in this area. There's no shrimp in the Bay Area anyway. And so eventually we started to study these organisms more and more, and we found that when algae produces photosynthesis, they produce these little bubbles. These little bubbles are sort of always happening, but this is what it looks like, one of those bubbles. But when a bubble is produced on these filaments, when they're about to leave the filament, it shakes. That shaking produces a ringing sound. And that ringing resonant sound of millions of bubbles is what you just heard. It's the sound of algae producing photosynthesis underwater. So this, I think, it was surprising to me about why we are only discovering such phenomena about algae. Algae is a very important organism. If there was ever a planetary savior to climate change, it would be algae, because it sequestrates about 50% of the carbon dioxide in the environment. And yet, until 5 years ago, we don't know about something like this. How is it possible? And I feel, the answer is not really in the engineering here, but really, I think, in the way we think about certain plants. We have a bias against plants. We like animals. We like certain kind of plants. We don't like certain kind of, plants. And algae especially is out of sight, out of mind. We forget about this. And so it's the bias that we have against some of these things that has prevented us from looking at organisms in multidimensional ways. So hydrophones allowed us to record this audio, but I was also just, not just treating this as from an engineering point of view to publish this and move on to the next thing, but but also culturally, how do people understand this? How do they reflect? How do they consider this from a different point of view? So we created these aquariums that were spread out throughout the world. We had one in New York, one in Tokyo, one in Linz in Austria at Ars Electronica. And what we created was an interaction where people are able to record voice messages and send it to these aquariums. These aquariums will process them as a sort of light-based input. The light-based input goes into the aquarium, and the algae responds by making bubbles, and those bubbles are collected as an audio message and sent back as email to people. So basically, people receive an email from this aquarium, but the time difference of human input, let's say 1 second in human input, is like 900 seconds in algae output. And so the prompt here, without saying anything, is, why is there such a big temporal difference? Considerations of the fact that human actions always take so long to propagate through a natural system. And how do we start to consider such things in a more reflective position? We all know often what the problem is, and the problems that we are facing right now with climate change, with personal behaviors, and with other things are not always explicit, prescription of something, but it's more introspective. So some of these positions are introspective in nature here. I will move on to maybe last two projects and try to wrap up with a discussion. This is a project that I showed in the beginning briefly, but this is a project from Yating Wu, who had created this project for an elephant Mary at the San Diego Zoo. She starts by keeping a box in front of the elephant. She tries to study the behavior. The elephant completely ignores the box. Nothing happens. And then she adds these affordances to each face of the box, recognizably different, where an elephant is able to see these affordances or also manipulate them. And the elephant is curious, but interacts with it for only 6 seconds. Then she talks to an elephant behavior scientist, and she asks them, what are the possibilities here? The elephant behavior scientist says that elephants like certain kind of sounds. They also don't like certain kind of sounds. If you're curious, they like classical sounds, classical music especially. They like Austrian music. They have good taste. So Yating created this intervention where she keeps this box where each face has different sound mapped to this box. And the elephant is not only curious, but keeps interacting with it for 2 hours. Significantly different because the elephant now has choice and control. And this is a non-food-based enrichment as opposed to the traditional food-based enrichment in conservation environments. So the elephant, is responding because it has choice and control. And one of these faces is turn off. So when the elephant doesn't want to listen to music, turns it off and goes about its day. In the context of post-anthropocentric design, beyond plants and animals, it's also important to recognize that organic materials are also part of this living ecology that can replace some of these artificial techniques. This is an example of a bioleather created by a student, Nguyen Tran. Nguyen was a Vietnamese fashion designer in our school, and she said, I am surprised by the toxicity of this material and yet the scale of this production in my hometown. So I would like to do something about it. What she did was she looked at some of the food waste produced in Vietnam, especially shrimp shells. And she took shrimp shells, coffee, and some binders like glycerin and created a bioleather out of them, which is what you see here, and started a company that is now funded by H&M, and it's a big thing where she produces for big brands, in terms of the bioleather. But to show you one more example of an organic material, an interface that is made of something that we see every day. When we shake a bottle of water, we see bubbles. We see bubbles almost every day, and yet we consider them as an ephemeral thing, a material that is impossible to use, but is almost by its very nature a fleeting material. And yet, what if it was not? What if we could actually create an interface where carbon dioxide bubbles in a liquid assemble to form text, patterns, and images. This is that project where we showcase how carbon dioxide bubbles might be used to create such patterns. So we've come up with a way to treat glass or plastic in ways that is invisible to the naked eye. We can use a hydrophobic material or plasma-based techniques to freeze surface of these materials. And when carbon dioxide falls on these materials, we can control not only their position, their size, but also how long it stays on a surface. But carbon dioxide bubbles in this case can stay on a surface for 5 days without significant disturbance. So bubbles are now a design material and not just an ephemeral thing. If you're German, maybe you're very possessive about your drinks, you will definitely like this. And other scenarios such as data visualizations, educational applications, and so on. Okay, so maybe this is the last thing I will show you, but this is not really a finished project per se, but it's more like a study, a study that also signifies the fact that, some of the solutions that I've learned to create through my background in engineering, can always just stay as that. But I also recognize that the solutions to some of the problems that you're facing are not only engineering driven, they're now cultural, where people need to have a more introspection. They need to consider some of the things that they're doing. They also need to be able to redefine some of the things that are coming out, let's say, in the field of AI, in the field of biomaterials, biodesign, and so on. So how can people have those conversations? In cultural venues defines now some of the work that we do. A few years ago, we created a payload in a Blue Origin rocket. Blue Origin is a company that allows you to rent space inside a rocket, and we can create a payload. What we created was a 4.5 inch by 4.5 inch by 7 inch payload, which has silver inside. When the rocket falls back on Earth, we get 3 minutes of microgravity. That is the window that we get to do some experiments. And with our payload, we had silver inside the payload growing crystals in zero gravity. We were studying why do plants or leaves grow the way they do? Why is there a fractalized structure? And why is the fact that even an inorganic material like silver grows something so organically, almost like a tree? And this is a project that informs some of our new things that we are doing about leaf tuning and some other things. But I think, it's a good example of how we focus on the process and the study and not only on the output alone. With that, I think, I also want to just maybe talk a little bit about the motivation and where this work comes from. When I grew up, my mother bought a few houseplants. They're still alive. They're as old as I am. And there is a value of deep coexistence with nature. The culture itself has a relationship with nature where we grow up, in courtyards while thinking about nature, in our literal surroundings. And that context is now very different where I live right now in New York, and we have these pockets of nature, where we have community gardens and maybe a central park. It's a very different way to think about nature, and the relationship is very different. The commodity or going to nature for enjoyment or to be able to experience nature is a commodified way of thinking about it. And sort of this is at a tension with how I've grown up thinking about nature. Even during the westward expansion in the US, there are philosophers who talk about nature very differently. Thomas Paine, he sees the natural world as an ally of democracy. Edmund Burke, on the other hand, he says art is man's nature. One suggests control, one suggests something else. And so, you can see this in several philosophical texts. But as I mentioned before, there are texts who talk about, how nature is a wilderness designed by God to become a garden and a storehouse of resources for national wealth. I feel like in most of these projects, it's not really about the production of this engineering solutions, but to change the imagination of people. And that's why over the years, when kids in Egypt to kids in Barcelona now write to me and they ask me how to make these robot plant things or how to do cyborg botany, I'm particularly thinking about the generation that had these relations and the generation that will have these relations. When putting out this work in botanical gardens, in galleries, I'm curious how people think about this work, what nature is, why do we separate it so much from technology, and how can people ask these questions, break these questions, and reframe our understanding of nature. This is a quote that is a favorite of mine from a professor of law at Harvard. It says, the planet's landscapes, its forests, its fields, are, along with the species that inhabit them, are a melange of those we have created, those we have let live. If nature were a place, we could not find it. If nature were a state of mind, we could not attain it. We are something else, and so is the world. So in all of these projects, from organic materials, plants, and animals, I feel, there is something very different than the computer worlds, the digital worlds, zeros and ones. At the intersection of these nature-based responses and our own computational materiality lies something more powerful, something that is not constrained by the ones and zeros. And each of these projects is based on the same principle. Materials of computation are active, and how do we create computation with the physical world around us, and also in turn try to understand the natural world much better. So through most of the work that I've shown today, my goal is to plainly ask, in a world that we can't help shaping, what will we shape? How can the technology become more organic? Thank you so much. And of course, I welcome any questions.
Thanks for your looking at our practice and also a simulation of prompts by people to communicate with the prompts. But I face some inquiry that routing will be capturing the perception of prompts, just an imagination that is out of the data captured from. So I would like to hear how you face or answer this.
Thank you for that question. It's an important one. For people online, if they did not hear, the question is, during work with the plants, if you encounter signals, how do you attribute what is happening? Really, how do you create an understanding of what plants are responding to? And I think, the answer here is to avoid anthropomorphism as much as possible. I mean, we have a normal tendency to anthropomorphize. We look at the clouds and we see human faces. We look at the comics and we see human faces. We want to see the human everywhere, and it's just a natural tendency that we try to create music out of mushrooms where mushrooms never create music, and we want to create something that feels familiar. And yet plants are a different species. Their livingness is different. Their ways of spreading or flourishing are different. And I think, to attribute something like human feelings to plants is fundamentally just wrong. And so to observe the plants, let's say a plant is growing, a plant is flourishing, a plant is doing what it does in its daily life, like a biologist would observe. seems more accurate and doesn't have these translation barriers that otherwise other human projects like mushroom music have, and so if you observe a plant over one period of one day, let's say a Mimosa pudica, you know that it responds to light because it is like this, and then it comes back, after the light turns on. During the evening, it is like this, and it goes down, That is your observation. It's nothing more and nothing less. To be able to attribute a human meaning to it would be wrong. And I think this is an example of an observation that is over a period of one day, but you can start to see the patterns over 30 days, over 1 year. And that is the practice that people need to inculcate much more, to not try to jump to conclusions, but to try to find patterns that helps you deepen your relationship with the plants. And also to think about it like a farmer. A farmer has a relationship with its plants, its crops, and yet, there are these implicit ways of care, that are harder to convey than objective measurements. So instead of attributing human feelings to it or human emotions to it, how do we just look at plants in the way that they just live in the world? It's a hard challenge, but I think we have some success stories from the farmers because they do this every day. There's
Just picking up on that about resisting anthropomorphization and talking to your title about the hybrid turn, and you're saying this third. Do you think we are at a point with a few things happening with acknowledgement that we understand intelligence is not the dominion of the human? We've seen that with some of the animal research showing octopuses. Do you think maybe we're at a turning point where we, as a collective species, are starting to be more open to the alienness of thought and thinking in that resistance to anthropomorphization, being more open to looking at something and not trying to impose human will into the process?
I think we are more and more open, and yet I think there are a few things that stop, us from thinking about it. We are very much, in the phase that people are still continuing with the human activities that destroy the environment. So if we were fully acknowledging the fact that the livingness of the plants and, us living us with other species matters, we would not be doing those activities. But, I feel like in the recent decade, when we are learning about plants more and more and learning about the multidimensional ways of plant living, I think we are coming to an understanding that plants are just much more than something like a green thing or a food that we eat. There are several new exciting things that are happening. One example is, this was a New York Times article maybe 2 to 3 years ago. The title was, "This is what plants sound like when they cry." I don't know if you probably saw that article. And the sound is like pop, 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 pop. It's the sound of a tomato that is dehydrated. It's trying to drink more water, and in the xylem, it has bubbles that are producing these sounds. And, it increases our understanding. We know that plants do this. We did not know about this. And so I think with the recent technologies, we will actually learn much more about it. But we are at a precipice where, technologies are looking at plants in different ways than we used to look at. Without those CIA experiments, where people say, "Oh, the plant moves, it's because I'm thinking about it," So that's not the kind of technological use that I'm talking about, but also, build a fuller understanding of what a plant is. And it is only possible when we start to understand that a plant lives more than absorbing water from the roots and changing the light, but it's also living its life in different ways with the insects, with the ecology around it. And the more we understand, I think the more we find that it's so incredibly complex. The project that I showed with the algaphone, it was a project for a few months, and it was the most complicated thing I'd ever had to do because to have a saltwater water aquarium at home during COVID, multiple aquariums at home, was the most complicated thing because the balance of this ecosystem is extremely hard to achieve, and I'm trying to get it to a condition where the algae is thriving so that it produces oxygen. It's an extremely complicated thing because it needs nitrates, cobalts, copper, and, X amount of things. And every morning I have to observe this, every evening I have to observe this. And so my learning was not really, of the project that I showed, but it's in the complexity of the ecosystem that I work with as well. And I feel like, if we had a better understanding of the plants in this manner, in many ways, we'll have a better relationship with them. And I think artists, designers, they are trying to do more work that helps us confront this reality in different ways so that we can introspect about this even more. Yes, but thank you for the question. Yes, I see a question online as well. Sure. It says, how far do you feel currently we can capture the signal of plant and its underlying meaning? And what is left that we should take further? I mean, if we knew the answer, I would do it, but it's in the continuous study of plants in many ways. Let's say, some of these things happen by accident. Some of these happen because you are considering plant physiology in deeper ways. Algophone happened by an accident. I was just curious about recording sound from a lake. But there are also examples that I just cited about tomato producing ultrasonic sounds. These are scientists that are trying to do recording of plant in ultrasonic domain, inaudible to the human ear. So there's a sort of deeper sound study that they're trying to do for a plant that we would otherwise not have done. And so I feel like, do plants absorb light? Do they only absorb it in visible spectrum? Do they also absorb it in UV or ultraviolet spectrum? Do they communicate with other species in ultrasonic domain? These are some of the fundamental questions that we've only started to understand, but there's more to be done in this area beyond a certain plant. Some of the work that we have seen is only with some model plants, but there's so many plants who behave in complex ways, in the ecology around us. Maybe if you're curious and if you would like to work on this, Ferrero Rocher, the chocolate company, it came to us recently and they said, like, we would like you to try to figure out if hazelnut, the tree, produces some kind of signals, before the fruiting or the fruiting happens, and it's important for them because if fruiting coincides with frosting, they will lose their crop. And if they can just tell that this thing is going to produce fruit and we can just harvest it before any seasonal intervention happens, they will save dollars, money. And so they said, can you study these signals? And I feel that's a gap, that's an immediate gap. So I'm giving you a problem if you want to work on, let me know if you find any solutions and we can contact Ferrero again. Thank you for the question. Yes.
I'm very interested in asking a question about when project showing it as an artwork, particularly for those in the gallery and the conference that you use the plant, occupied with human positions and the aquarium that you showed the interaction. So the outcome you're showing that capture the sound, and then my understanding is you sort of like artistic translate the sound of the plant into some sort of message, linguistic, that human understand. Have you ever considered? I understand that bigly. You probably want to create some sort of criticality or reflexive dimensions when you're showing to the public. But have you ever considered to just not translate it in a very comprehensible way that that leaves some sort of interesting, not comprehensible interaction between plant and human being? After we were in different condition of living.
Right. Thank you for that question. I mean, it's a very important question that I think about a lot when projects like electrophysiology come about. You know, there's a high semantic translation in some projects where we attribute meaning that the plants don't have. Mushroom music is the highest semantic translation, meaning plants don't create music. It's false, and yet we are translating from what might be mushroom signals into something else. In fact, mushrooms don't even produce that many signals, by the way. You know, so we need to acknowledge the fact that any translations that we might be doing need to have either low translation or low semantic translation or almost no translation. In AlgaPhone, for example, this project with algae, you know, I feel like there is almost no translation because what people receive in the end is algae audio. There's no translation of converting it to text or something, you know. And so they're just hearing bubble sounds. You know, what they make out of it is up to them. And I think that's the space that you might be talking about. In the other project that I showed in the beginning here with plants producing these sounds, you know, we dealt with this question. It's very strange to convert the sounds of plants to human readable text because it leads you to understand that plants maybe talk like this, you know. But we are problematizing where we are also, you know, asking people to consider are plants talking like this, you know, and it's quite obvious, you know, because of the fidelity of this translation that people are confused or surprised, you know, by the fact that plants may be talking about this. But here, I think the translation isn't so much the point, but the point might be for people to, you know, just think about the fact that plants may be talking, but we don't understand it, and we are talking about plants, and yet they don't understand it. You know, so there's a gap here that we're trying to provoke. I think in terms of the legibility of the sounds that we create out of this is still, I think, creating a mysterious atmosphere, you know, where you kind of hear these sounds. Let me see if I can play this. When you walk into a gallery, you know, you continue to hear these sounds. This is not the only kind of Morse code-like sound that you hear, but you continue to hear these sounds, and they're not really legible or understandable to you. And it is still within the space where, you know, we ask people to think what might be happening and not really translate. And then we ask people to maybe hold their phones and start to see what is happening. But you're right. I think, you know, in general, any projects that people should do, they should consider interpretation of those results to have low semantic translation or almost no translation, which is what we did in AlgaPhone as well. Yes.
Thank you for that break. And it really makes me think about what is nature to me, especially when you ask the question, right? And I think, in my view, nature is really something that's not altered by human beings. And with that, it makes me feel like there seems to be a dilemma where, on the one hand, all those technologies help us to understand all those nature better. But on the other hand, since those technologies are like making those unaltered stuff fewer and fewer. So how do you see this like balance between like, should we use the technology to understand them, or we leave them as nature as it is?
I mean, should we, you know, I think the idea of you know, defining nature is an evasive thing. So I don't know if I can do a good job at this, but our relationship to nature is an evolving relationship. And to me, it doesn't have as much purist ideas of leaving nature completely alone, because we live in nature and we are sort of creating our intersections with plants and animals, and we're trying to figure out how to subsist and do these interventions. You know, in indigenous knowledges, wisdoms, or, you know, ways of living, it is quite evident that there are clear ways of of living with a certain species and yet establishing ways of not under or over consuming, being able to take care of the land and so on. In the modern ways of doing this with technology, there's a slippery slope, meaning if I intervene with nature and I intervene in the wrong way, it might just be, very problematic, or it might just go downhill. I might destroy the whole ecosystem. And, so there is acknowledgement of that aspect. And yet I feel like if you look at how a farmer lives with the land, is that change or is that something else? There is a farmer who might take care of a farm in a certain way by actually creating crops that are a mix of certain things and not just monoculture. There are also farmers who might rely completely on chemicals and pesticides and want more and producing every season, And so both of them are doing farming, and yet they're doing it differently. So I feel like if you're designing those technologies, where is that balance? Is really hard to figure out, but we need that relationship, and that relationship is evolving. And I think, to give you an example of where that slippery slope might be, people, I think during 1960s or 70s, this is the time when people are thinking about remediation in the US, in the Chicago Great Lakes area. And one of the scientists comes up with a solution that the silver carp is a fish that can eat some toxins and clean up the lakes, and we'll suddenly have a great ecosystem. And they bring the silver carp in the Chicago, in the lakes near Chicago. And it turns out it's an invasive species, and it basically eats everything. And there's only one kind of fish now in that ecosystem. Now we're stuck. What do we do? There's also Great Lakes attached to the Chicago lake, which are also big ecosystems, very important for life and just food. So the solution that the Army Corps of Engineers comes up with is build an electrified canal so that some fish cannot cross from one lake to the other. So the river, the fish tries to cross, it gets stunned, and then it goes back. So this is a modern solution to a modern problem. Do we really need an electrified canal? It couldn't have gone wrong if we would have studied the ecological relations much better, but it is also very complex to study those relations. But to go back to your question, do we need technologies to study? There are examples out there that when we understood our own physiology better, we live our life better. By using a microscope or other physiology-based instruments, we live our life better. Wouldn't that be the same case for plants when we look at their cells, the way they live, that we understand their life better? So that's the sort of lens that I'm considering when designing these technologies. But there might be someone else who doesn't agree with this, and I also acknowledge that view. But to me, I think nature, our relationship is always evolving. I don't hold a very purist view of this.